All right, we're in 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19. The first question, how should Elijah have known his first statement in verse 22 was untrue? He says here, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord. In verse 13, Obadiah had said to him, was it not told, my Lord, what I did when Jezebel slew the prophets of the Lord, how I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50 in a cave and fed them with bread and water. This is just a little while before he makes that statement that he's the only prophet of the Lord remaining, but he had just been told that 100 prophets of the Lord had been spared when Jezebel was seeking to slay them. Now, of course, that could have been a long time ago, and maybe it's years gone by since she was trying to slay them, but it's reasonable to conclude, and it would be reasonable for him to conclude, that at least some of those 100 prophets that had not been slain were still alive, and we're still in Israel, and we're still faithful prophets of God. That would be reasonable. And even if he said it with a little less certainty, I am one of the few prophets, or I might be the only prophet, but he says, I only am a prophet, remain a prophet of the Lord. And that statement was most likely untrue, and he should have known that that statement was untrue. Second question, why do you think he came to this false conclusion? Now, of course, we can't know how he came to this conclusion, why, but there are elements of his recent life that would have likely led him to come to such a conclusion. Remember, for a while during the famine, he's first alone. He doesn't even know another human. He's with ravens who are bringing him food at the brook, and he's not around anyone else, just he and his God. And that's a good place to be, because during that time, his faith would be strengthened. During that time, he would be growing in his relationship with God, and he would be built up in his experience with God. But then God says, no, you need to go now to be with this widow. And maybe God was saying that because maybe he needed to have another human in his life as well. So he's with the widow and her son and other people within that city. And so he's now having a little time with other people. And he's also able to see from that widow that here is a faithful child of God that he didn't know about, who's in a foreign land, in a heathen land, not even of the Israelites. But this woman is a faithful child of God that God had kept from idolatry, even in a heathen land. And perhaps that's one of the reasons that God was calling him to go to the woman, so he could see that, yes, Elijah, it's great to have this relationship with you and I, but I don't want you to think that you're the only one that's still seeking me, Elijah, because I have here even a heathen woman in a heathen land who has not bowed the knee to Baal, but she is still a worshiper, one who fears the God of Israel. But even after that, then he comes back and God calls him to go to Ahab and show himself to Ahab, and God says he will send rain. But before he meets Ahab, I believe God directs that he should run into not Ahab, but Obadiah, the steward of Ahab's house. And he runs into Obadiah, and then Obadiah lets him know, not only is the widow also faithful, not only has God reserved people in foreign lands, even Obadiah himself is a testimony that God has reserved people even in the court of the wicked king Ahab. Right under Jezebel's nose, there's a faithful child of God who is trying to do right. So Elijah, you're not the only one. It's not just you and God. It's you and God, yes, but it's also the widow and God who's faithful. It's also Obadiah in the courts of Ahab who is still faithful. But even in addition to that, Ahab tells him of these at least 100 prophets that have been spared the sword of Jezebel, and that they too are also seeking God. I believe when you put these things together, it seems like God was trying to prevent him from coming to 1 Kings chapter 19 when he runs away from Jezebel and he goes to the mountain and eventually says again, I only. This is 1 Kings chapter 19 in verse 10. He says, to God now, I only am left, and they seek my life. Talking of the prophets, he's the only prophet left. God's response to him verbally is in verse 18, where God says, yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which has not kissed him. And so in addition to prophets, there's at least 100 prophets that we have here, but there are also thousands of Israelites who have not bowed the knee to Baal. He had met Obadiah. He had met even the non-Israelite, the widow, who were faithful to God even in this time. And it seems this was a point. Now again, I'm going to be honest that I'm saying things that are not explicitly stated here, but I believe putting all of these things together is reasonable to conclude that this was an issue Elijah faced, and this was a message that God was trying to get through to him, that Elijah, yes, I love the relationship that you and I have, but don't be confused. You are not the only faithful one. You are not the only one who is seeking me, even in this time of apostasy. And this is the third question. How do you think this false conclusion contributed to what he did in chapter 19? That's where he asks that God would take his life in verse 4, that he would die because he's depressed. He's afraid of Jezebel. And again, also owing likely to this idea that he's the only faithful child of God that remains. The fourth question, what was God's response to this false conclusion? And that's what I mentioned in chapter 19, verse 18. Let's go to the fifth question. If this was the case during one of the greatest apostasies in Israelite history, what does this suggest for our day? If during one of the darkest times in Israel's spiritual history, God had reserved 7,000 faithful ones who had not bowed the knee to Baal, what does that suggest? We're going to look at Romans chapter 11. This is Paul speaking. Paul makes a commentary on this very passage. Romans chapter 11, I'm looking at verses 2 through 4. God has not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elias, or Elijah? How he made intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and digged down your altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. Verse 4, but what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. I'm going to look at verse 5 as well. Even so then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Yes, similar to Elijah's day, God has also reserved him thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even hundreds. I don't know. I don't know how many, but God has reserved to himself those who are faithful. And what Elijah's story teaches us, lessons that we can learn from Elijah's story, is that when we find that we are the only faithful one that we know, we are the only one who's having a genuine relationship with God. We're the only one who's seeking truth as God wants us to seek it. We're the only one that's being faithful to all the truth that God has revealed. When we feel that we're having that attitude, Elijah's message speaks to us. When we feel that we have that attitude, God is saying that, hey, I love the relationship that you have with me. I enjoy the time with just you, me, the ravens, and the brook. But also there are heathens that do not even understand the worship of God, who have not been privileged to have maybe even the scriptures in the form that you have them. There are heathens that I have reserved that are following me, that are trusting the little bit of knowledge that they do have of me. God is saying that to us just as verily as he was saying it to Elijah through the widow and her son. Also, God is saying, hey, you criticize the evil that is in government and the terrible things that are happening in the nations and in the world. But even among the great wicked men of this world, God may be reserving Obadiahs who are faithful even in the seat of power of wickedness and of evil, that God has reserved even among those elites, those men and perhaps women who are faithful to God and will not bow the knee to Baal. Even when we don't see them, there may be hundreds of other prophets that God has said, that God has protected and said, these are mine and I will not allow them to be snuffed out by Satan's physical or spiritual violence that he seeks to accomplish. Even besides those, God is saying to you, God is saying to me that he has hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions who he has reserved who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Now, these 7,000 may not have been all together in one place. So maybe even they themselves individually didn't know about each other. Maybe they, like Elijah, felt like you may feel sometime, or I may feel sometime. It's only us. But God has a way of reminding us that there are others. And hopefully he can bring us into contact with those others, as he did with Elijah and Obadiah and Elijah and the widow. Bring us into contact with those. And as Malachi says, then those who feared the Lord spoke often one to another. Then God can bring us to mutually encourage each other. I can imagine the times in the morning or in the evenings when Elijah and the widow would just talk about the goodness of God. She would tell her experience. I don't really know all about Moses, but I know this, that God, when I needed him, he showed himself for me. And that's why I trust the God of Israel and not the God of my people. Those who feared the Lord spoke often one to another and encouraged each other and helped each other to grow in the faith. As it was in Elijah's day, so it is now, that we need each other. that others are out there. And we, by the grace of God, are going to make it if we press together with those who are seeking, those who are like-minded, those who God is calling, and seek also to help others as Elijah did with all the nation of Israel who had gone into apostasy.